Chapter 5. From the not-so-roaring 20s to the Great Depression, 1925 to 1933. The peace signed in Versailles represented the end of the war, but the dead simply could not be forgotten. The devastated cities were silent testimonies of what had happened, while civil disorder and unemployment were the order of the day, a perfect setting for dictators. It was necessary to forget so many things. That was why a golden age blossomed. It was seen as a period to live life to the fullest, to compensate for past sufferings and to make up for lost time by pushing down on the accelerator of life. By 1925, memories of the Great War were dim and money flowed freely. People spent with a passion, with just one goal in mind: to live better. In spite of the dark clouds on the future's horizon, there was a relative social calm. Intellectuals even saw matters in a more positive light, as if the First World War had buried old forms of life forever. Workers' movements became less belligerent. In spite of the fact that major differences existed between social classes, there was food and work for all. Economic development, the shift of large numbers of farmers into urban environments, a fall in the illiteracy rate, the entry of women into the social fabric, and the new labor legislation had a strong effect on relations between workers and their bosses. The Great War had ruined many and had enriched others. Europe had survived the conflict with its resources exhausted, its transport and communications networks destroyed, and its production infrastructures devastated. On the other hand, the United States emerged as a world power. It had been untouched by the distant war, while its industries had greatly benefited. Upon the death of President Harding in August 1923, his successor, Vice President Calvin Coolidge, hardly changed governmental policies. He was more conservative than Harding and more sensitive to the interests of the great tycoons. He also fought all kinds of radicalism and change. At that time, the presidency of the United States had been discredited by different scandals, but the chief executive was pressured by many pressing problems, both at home and abroad. America had been virtually unaffected by any kind of crisis over the past years of economic expansion. Taxes fell, business interests were favored, and protectionist measures were maintained. The economy was first and foremost. Between 1924 and 1929, a major increase in white-collared workers was registered. Urban populations increased. At the same time, the revenues of the upper classes jumped. By 1929, the annual per capita income in America was above $680. Herbert Hoover succeeded Coolidge as president. Both Coolidge and his Secretary of the Treasury, Mallon, preached get-rich-quick schemes. October the 24th, 1929 became known in history as Black Thursday. On that day, 13 million stocks exchanged hands. The prices of stocks plummeted as never before on the New York Stock Exchange. It took a couple of years for the slump to touch bottom, but by that time, two-thirds of the companies traded had disappeared on the exchange. Many factories were closed, mortgages were foreclosed, and houses and businesses were lost. There were runs on banks and dividends weren't paid. The prices of such basic products as wheat, cotton, copper, oil, meat, and a long list of etceteras all fell. The purchasing power of millions of families plummeted, while foreign trade dropped dramatically. Unemployment spread at an alarming rate. 3 Olympic Games were held in that decade. The Olympiad staged in Paris made a deep impression on sports circles due to the exploits of Paavo Nurmi, the Finnish track athlete. He set 20 world records and won 9 Olympic gold medals. The economic crisis and the Great Depression also took its toll on the Olympics. The Games held in Los Angeles in 1932 were deeply affected. The high cost of traveling and stays reduced the number of participants. The League of Nations, headquartered in Geneva, was created to guarantee the independence of smaller nations after the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. It became a forum for international debate. At first, the absence of the United States counteracted its multiple possibilities. However, it was an excellent diplomatic showcase for a time when peace was needed. The atmosphere had cleared up by 1925. Europe had recovered from inflationary problems, currencies had stabilized in the majority of countries, while the USSR and the main countries had re-established diplomatic relations. As a result of the Dawes Plan in 1924, Germany agreed to pay reparations to the victors of the First World War. From 1925 to 1928, Germany had recovered to such an extent that it was the world's second leading power. France also recovered. A period of rapprochement between countries ensued. The League of Nations prepared the Pact of Locarno that was signed in 1925 by France, Belgium and Germany. With the approval of England and Italy, provisions for frontier stability were agreed upon, and Germany was subsequently allowed to join the League. Two leading politicians were the architects of this rapprochement process, the Frenchman Aristide Briand and the German Gustav Stresemann, who did much for international understanding. Lenin died in 1924, leaving a profound schism within the heart of Russian communism. In 1922, Russia's name had been changed to SSSR. One of the country's political factions, headed by Leo Trotsky, favored exporting communism all over the world. It was planned as an ongoing revolutionary process so that no revisionism or turning back would be possible. Trotsky was backed by members of the old guard. The struggle between Stalin and Trotsky was terrible and led to Trotsky's expulsion in 1929. In 1930, the 16th Congress of the Communist Party recognized Stalin as the country's paramount leader. Stalin had an obsession, the industrialization of the country, and he achieved it. In 1928, he started a process in which the landed peasants of Russia, called kulaks, were stripped of their possessions. The whole process was quite brutal. The collectivization of land, agriculture and livestock raising was underway. The megalomania of the dictator knew no limits. He achieved everything he proposed by persecuting all dissidents, by creating the perfect police state. In spite of his violent methods, Stalin gave Russia a collective goal, a constructive moral purpose, a united destiny. Everyone seemed to want the same for the USSR, for it to become the leading world power. He almost did it, even though it cost the blood, sweat and tears of millions of Russians who were deported and who died in innumerable concentration camps. In October 1925, the Pact of Locarno represented an international opportunity to peacefully settle existing problems. Dialogue was in the air. The Englishman Chamberlain, the Frenchman Briand, the German Stresemann, and the Italian Mussolini renounced violence. The excellent economic situation contributed to detente. The climate of pacifism seemed a reality. In 1926 and 1927, the Disarmament Conference and the International Economic Conference were held. Prosperity gave way to euphoria. People spoke of a belle époque, happy years, prosperity, and the roaring 20s. They were golden years in which capitalism created wealth, modernized companies, and improved the quality of life. Aviation represented an unstoppable revolution in the world of transport. In May 1927, Charles A. Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic with his Spirit of St. Louis, a non-stop solo flight from New York to Paris in 33.5 hours, covering a total distance of 5,809 kilometers. Although largely unnoticed, one of the most innovative and revolutionary inventions was introduced in 1929 in a small town of New York. Michael Cullen inaugurated the first supermarket. Low prices were one way to face up to the crisis. The car was so popular that by 1927, 1 out of every 4 Americans had one. The Ford assembly lines produced half of the cars on the world's roads. Its Model T represented America's industrial drive. The car was the leading exponent of a happy and trusting era. Apart from useful, it represented freedom, privacy, and status. In his Modern Times, Charlie Chaplin showed the nature of new working methods. It was a bittersweet song to machines and to assembly lines. The virtue of saving money was frowned upon. People were asked to spend, buy, stockpile wealth, objects, things. It soon became virtually impossible to find people who didn't have debts. This change in mentality, the conversion of people into consumers, slowly eroded social stability. Films became the most popular form of entertainment. The burial of Rudolph Valentino in 1926, shortly after the premiere of The Son of the Sheikh, showed how popular his films really were. There were close to 1,000 movie theaters in the United States by the time a suburb of Los Angeles, Hollywood, started to become the mecca of film in 1927. That year, the first talking motion picture was released, The Jazz Singer. The only thing heard in the film were the songs by Al Jolson and a few lines by the stars. The prizes of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences soon appeared. The first were awarded in 1927 in the Hollywood Roosevelt Hotel in Los Angeles and were called Oscars by 1931. The silver screen had become a new art form. In Russia, Eisenstein shot the battleship Potemkin in 1925. The same year, Chaplin premiered The Gold Rush. Austrian Fritz Lang, the director of directors, created Metropolis, an expressionist vision of the world which had a major impact. Subtle and slapstick humor was found in Harold Lloyd's comical productions, as in Buster Keaton's The General. Others who were known for their comedy routines on the screen were Laurel and Hardy. Greta Garbo started her rise to stardom in 1931. Hyper-capitalism resorted to economic methods that caused major problems for less developed nations and eased the way for the communist message. Single crop systems were instituted. As a result, third world countries largely depended on the fluctuations in the prices of raw materials and commodity markets elsewhere in the world. This was the case of sugar in Cuba, coffee in Brazil, and bananas throughout Central America. In the America of Calvin Coolidge, whose mandate stretched over 3 years, social customs grew more relaxed. The number of cabarets, music halls, and shows of all kinds multiplied. Women became part of social life, and for the first time in history, the length of skirts grew shorter. They participated in activities that were previously off-limits to women. The rhythm of life was set by the foxtrot and the charleston. In 1927, the spring fashion stunned Paris. Dresses rose to knees and they hugged hips. Black was the dominating color, highlighting women's figures. At long last, Valium was invented in 1933, a drug that fought the effects of headaches and anxiety, largely brought on by the dramatic changes in Western society. The first National Congress of the Ku Klux Klan was held in Washington. Preaching racial violence, this group boasted a power organization with more than 5 million members, and they practiced what they preached. They were always ready to physically eliminate blacks, Jews, and Catholics. Even before 1930, the United States had stretched its influence throughout the Caribbean and Central America. It had become the leading power in the Western Hemisphere, which provided produce and raw materials needed in new markets. The boom in car manufacturing led to the hyper-development of other industries: glass, oil, rubber, tooling, while greater attention was paid to other agricultural raw materials from Latin America. And precisely in Latin America, the crisis was experienced more intensely. Social conflict and revolutions resulted from the Depression. The massive fall in exports was followed by low exchange rates and financial unbalance, which generated political and social unrest. Revolutionary movements sometimes took a liberal turn, but they were more often than not totalitarian in scope. The fall in coffee exports dragged Brazil into a revolution in 1930. In Argentina, the radical government led by Irigoyen was overthrown by the military led by General Uriburu after the fall of the local currency. Chile also experienced a serious crisis after synthetic nitrates threatened the most important export product of that country. The religious protests in Mexico echoed the anti-clericalism of the political left, which often ignored the desires of the people. The Communist Party was created in Cuba. It proposed to put an end to the influence of the Catholic Church, which it claimed was in collusion with the corrupt regime of Gerardo Machado. The Peruvian Communist Party was also born in Lima. It aspired to set up a dictatorship of the proletariat, while the APRA used its own methods to fight American influence. In general, strikes and unrest raged in the majority of countries. People rose up against what was considered the United States threat. The event that triggered the situation was the treaty that limited Panamanian sovereignty signed in 1926. Sandino refused to accept the legality of the American intervention in Nicaragua. As a result of the world production, pace markets were flooded with products, supply was greater than demand, and prices dived. Salaries simply remained the same or grew by very little. As a result, purchasing power remained the same. Investment fell since stock market profits were practically non-existent. In 1924, Lenin died, while Stalin's star grew. The same was true of Hitler. In Italy, Benito Mussolini, who was a socialist until 1925, took refuge in a fascist totalitarianism backed by the moneyed classes, and by 1926, all power was in his hands. The people also supported him because he was able to draw on the development and prosperity that had brought international prestige to Italy. Like Primo de Rivera in Spain, one of Mussolini's obsessions was public works, and especially communications infrastructures such as rail lines and roads. He had the Latin obsession of achieving magnificence in all things. His political thought was tinged with philanthropy and patriotic altruism. With flags and banners, uniforms and songs, slogans and parades, fascism had a hypnotic effect on the masses. The foundation of Catholic action by Pope Pius X, whose pontificate ranged throughout this period of history, represented a way to counteract the frenzied attacks against the Catholic Church from materialism, racism, totalitarianism, and the cult of violence. Anti-imperialist winds also swept through many lands. The north of Africa rose up against French rule, while India rebelled against England. In 1930, Mahatma Gandhi decided to disobey the laws imposed by the English by adopting an unusual approach: passive resistance. Relations with the British simply went nowhere. By 1927, Chiang Kai-shek had put an end to the civil wars in China, and at the head of the Revolutionary Army, he marched on the north to unify the country and take Beijing in 1928. However, the command of the Revolutionary Army was divided after Shanghai was seized. The conservatives moved away from the Soviet advisors and tried to found a totalitarian state. The extreme left consolidated its position in the provinces of Guangxi and Fujian and founded the Communist Party under Mao Zedong and Chu Tai. In 1925, Japan was immersed in a world campaign to obtain new markets, the only solution to its own serious economic crisis. Upon the death of Emperor Taisho in 1926, Japan believed that one era had ended and another had begun with Hirohito, the shower reign. In 1931, radical officers took matters into their own hands and began the Manchuria War. The League of Nations harshly censured the resulting new state. As a result of the West's position, Japan left the League in March 1933. In spite of the terms of the Washington Treaty, Japan began to rearm. Troubles only grew. When Hindenburg was re-elected, he appointed Hitler as Chancellor. It was January 30th, 1933. Hitler dissolved Parliament and called new elections. He was able to implicate Social Democrats and Communists in the burning of the Reichstag 1 week later. As a result, he obtained a comfortable majority in the elections. In 1929, England's Labour Prime Minister MacDonald formed a coalition government. Trying to find solutions to the economic crisis, he lowered salaries, limited unemployment subsidies, and adopted a series of measures that were greeted by a wave of strikes. The country's budgetary deficit grew from 1931 to 1932 by over £800 million. The currency was devaluated, the gold standard was abandoned, and free trade was renounced. The economic crisis reached France 1 or 2 years after the start of the Great Depression, but the strained relations between the National Bloc and the leftist coalition only contributed to make economic matters worse. Poincaré, president from 1926 to 1929, had devalued the franc and had adopted protectionist policies for industry and agriculture by means of strong protective tariffs. But by 1931, the economic crisis was enormous. As a result of Wall Street inheritance, both Hitler and the Soviet system were reinforced and consolidated. The spectre of revolution lurked everywhere. Unrest served to strengthen totalitarian positions. A fanatical Germany was divided right down the middle between the left and the right, 6 million on each side. In 1931, the conservatives subsidized Hitler's party in view of the advances made by the political left: street rioting, unrest, inflation, and economic difficulties. Re-elected in 1932, Hindenburg appointed Franz von Papen as Chancellor. It was May 1932. He also legalized the Nazis again, hoping that their voters would join him. An event of key importance took place in 1924. Ernest Rutherford saw the possibility of splitting the atom and started to do so. The stage was set for nuclear development. In 1930, Ernest Orland Lawrence built the cyclotron, a small device scarcely more than 11 centimeters in diameter, employed to accelerate particles. 2 years later, James Chadwick discovered the neutron. The atomic era had begun. An era of science of major importance took its first steps in 1926, rocket development. A little-known American scientist, Robert Goddard, experimented with strange artifacts in the yard of his home in Massachusetts. In the Europe of 1930, a group of young scientists, including Werner von Braun, began to experiment with rockets propelled by liquid fuel. Medicine also made major advances. In 1928, Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin while he observed how a Staphylococcus bacteria was destroyed by a mold. In the field of art, 1927 saw the death of the Spaniard Juan Gris. Together with Picasso, Francis Picabet and Braque, Juan Gris had been one of the founders of Cubism. His paintings, such as The Lunch and were the culminating works for a golden age of art. Everything was changing. Art was going the way of society. Painting was influenced by the troubles of the times. The key word for this new tendency was invented by the French poet Apollinaire: surrealism. Kafka published The Trial, and Hitler wrote Mein Kampf, a work that would herald the deaths of millions. In 1926, Thomas Edward, known as Lawrence of Arabia, published his 7 Pillars of Wisdom, and in 1933, during a time of great tragedy, Malraux wrote Les Conditions Humaines. José Ortega y Gasset studied the social nature of the times in his Rebellion of the Masses. The title certainly did justice to the age. Everything was taking a sad and dramatic turn, anticipating the forthcoming disaster. Architectural art also took on a whole new dimension. The German Bauhaus movement, or the Swiss Le Corbusier, developed their architecture with volumes, cubes, spheres, and pyramids that floated on shafts with a plastic effect. The American Frank Lloyd Wright. And finally, the flight skywards. Vertical architecture and New York's Empire State Building that amazed the world in 1931. After its first uncertain steps following the Great Depression of 1929, Marxism seemed to be right. Capitalism would soon destroy itself. The words of novelist Charles Louis Philippe in 1897 seemed to take on a whole new light. The age of courtesy and dilettantism has ended. What we need now are a few barbarians. the door was now open to not only a few barbarians, but to a great many.